When Catherine moved to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, she thought she had found the perfect place to start a new life. The house was cozy, overlooking a small park, and the neighboring homes were spaced far enough apart to maintain a sense of privacy. The only thing that slightly unsettled her was the old, abandoned house across the street. Its windows were boarded up, the roof had partially collapsed, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. The neighbors shared different stories. Some said the house had been vacant for decades, while others whispered about tragedies that had supposedly occurred inside. But Catherine didn't believe in urban legends. She focused on her work and enjoyed her new home. At first, everything went well. During the day, Catherine worked from home, and in the evenings, she watched shows or read books. But one night, while staying up late at her computer, she caught a glimpse of movement in the window of the abandoned house across the street. She froze and looked in that direction. One of the boarded-up windows seemed slightly ajar, and something had moved behind it. Her heart began to race. Maybe it's just a shadow, Catherine thought, but to be sure, she turned off the light in her room. Now she could see the house's window more clearly. Someone was there. A figure stood behind the glass, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was motionless, but Catherine was certain it was watching her. She tried convincing herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, summoning her courage, she went outside and walked around the house across the street. All the windows were boarded up, and the doors were locked with a rusty padlock. There were no signs or traces of anyone having been there recently. It's just my nerves, she decided, heading back home. But the next night, it happened again. She spotted the silhouette in the window. This time, it moved, slowly and deliberately, as though observing her. Catherine grabbed her phone and took a photo of the window. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't sit idly anymore. She decided to send the picture to a friend. When she zoomed in to better see the silhouette, her heart stopped. In the darkness of the window, two eyes were visible. Foreign, cold eyes staring directly at her. She immediately called the police. The officers searched the house but found nothing unusual. "There's no one there, ma'am," they assured her, noticing her anxious state. Catherine wanted to believe she was mistaken, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. By the third night, her fear turned into panic. She decided to stay awake and set up a camera at her window to record whatever was happening. Her plan was simple: get evidence and show it to the police. She sat on the couch with a cup of coffee, occasionally glancing at the camera feed. Around 3 a.m., she heard a faint rustling. Catherine flinched and looked at the monitor. On the recording, a face appeared in the window across the street. It was pressed against the glass, its features distorted, as if the person had leaned their entire head against the pane. This was more than just a human gaze. It was something unnatural, staring directly at the camera. Catherine jumped up, turned off the monitor, and pressed herself against the wall. Her heart pounded loudly, her breathing uneven. A few seconds later, her phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from the camera. Movement detected. She wanted to check what happened next, but her phone slipped from her hands. The camera continued to record as something from the house across the street moved toward hers. The next day, Catherine decided to learn everything she could about the house. She visited her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, who had lived on the street the longest. "That house is best left alone, dear," Mrs. Wilson said when Catherine mentioned her nighttime sightings. "People say it's cursed. A family used to live there, but one day they just vanished. No one knows what happened to them." Catherine tried not to believe these stories, but Mrs. Wilson's words lingered in her mind. That night, she saw movement in the window again, but this time, the silhouette wasn't stationary. It moved slowly and deliberately. Then, it disappeared from the window. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. A minute later, she heard knocking at her front door. She froze, too scared to move. The knocking came again. It was slow and rhythmic. "Who's there?" she shouted, but no one replied. Catherine approached the door, trying not to make a sound. She peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. No one was there. Breathing heavily, she returned to the living room. Her phone buzzed again. The camera had detected motion, but this time, it wasn't across the street. On the screen, she saw her front door slowly opening. From that moment on, everything became a blur. The last thing she remembered was the sound of footsteps behind her. The next day, Catherine's house was empty. Her neighbors noticed the lights had been on all night, but there was no sign of her anywhere. In the house across the street, the window that had once been boarded up was now wide open. They say that sometimes at night you can see a silhouette in that window. It stands there, staring at Catherine's house, as if waiting for her to come back. Jessica had never liked being alone at night, especially after she and her husband moved into a new house on the outskirts of a small town. Their house stood on a quiet street, surrounded by sparse streetlights casting faint light on the deserted sidewalk. Jessica's husband, Michael, often went on business trips, leaving her alone with their 2 young children. Usually, she managed the loneliness, but that night something felt off. Jessica put the children to bed, checked the locks on the windows and doors, and returned to the living room to watch a show. Time seemed to pass slowly. It was around midnight when she heard a faint creak. She froze. The sound was coming from the front door. Maybe it's the wind, Jessica thought, but decided to check. Approaching the door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar. This was strange, as she was sure she had locked it before going to bed. She cautiously peeked outside. It was quiet, empty. The night was windless, and not a single bush stirred. A sense of unease crept into her chest, but she convinced herself that she might have just left the door slightly open. She locked it and returned to the living room. About an hour passed. Jessica had almost calmed down when she heard the sound again. This time, the door opened wider, with a creak that shattered the silence of the house. Her heart raced. She grabbed her phone, turned off the lights, and hid behind the couch. Her breath became shallow, and her fingers trembled as she dialed the police. When the officers arrived, they thoroughly examined the house. The door was closed again, and there were no signs of forced entry. However, there were dirty shoe prints on the porch and around the door. The police reassured her that someone might have tried to break in but was scared off. They promised to return in the morning for a more thorough investigation. Jessica couldn't sleep the whole night. Every shadow outside the window seemed like movement, every creak a threat. The next morning, the officers returned and began examining the prints more closely. They took fingerprints from the door and noted the shoe sizes. One of them, Sergeant Harper, remarked that the prints looked strange. "Something's not right here," he said, staring thoughtfully at the print. "They're too clear, like someone stood here for a long time." Later that day, the police told Jessica something that made her blood run cold. The prints belonged to a person who couldn't have been here. A person who had died 5 years ago. Jessica felt goosebumps cover her body as the officers explained the details. The prints matched a record in the database belonging to George Martin, a man who had once lived in this house. He was found dead in a nearby forest, and his death was ruled an accident. But why had his prints suddenly appeared on the door? The police tried to reassure her, suggesting that the data might have been entered incorrectly or that someone had attempted to forge the prints. But Jessica felt that this was no coincidence. That night, she couldn't sleep. Constantly glancing at the door, she expected to hear that same creak. But instead, at 2 in the morning, she heard another sound. This time, it was knocking. Slow, muffled, as if someone were knocking on the door with an open palm. Jessica froze. She knew the children were upstairs, and there shouldn't have been anyone outside. Breathing heavily, she slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. There was no one there, but the knocking continued. She returned to the living room and turned on the surveillance camera they had recently installed by the front door. Her heart raced as a strange silhouette appeared on the screen. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. The silhouette stood right in front of the door, but its face was hidden, as if a shadow concealed its features. It stood completely still, but its hand continued to knock slowly. Jessica tried to call the police, but her phone couldn't get a signal. She turned off the lights, holding her breath, and sat in the corner of the room, praying that everything would stop. A few minutes later, the knocking stopped. But when she looked at the camera screen, she saw the figure turn and disappear into the darkness. The next day, the police reviewed the footage from the camera. Surprisingly, they couldn't find anything. The footage showed no silhouette, just the empty door and the sidewalk in front of the house. But Jessica knew what she had seen. She started researching the house's past and George Martin's life. Her investigation led her to an old newspaper article. George had been found dead near the house under mysterious circumstances. At the time, rumors circulated that his death might not have been an accident. Some suspected that he had been trying to protect his home from burglars. But the most chilling detail was that George's last words, according to witnesses, were, "They're trying to get in again." Jessica sold the house a few months later and moved to another city. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she wakes up to a strange sound. It's always the same sound, the slow creak of an opening door. When Monica found an apartment in the city center at an incredibly low price, she didn't hesitate. A quiet neighborhood, proximity to work, an affordable price. It all seemed too good to be true. She took the keys without paying much attention to the details of the apartment's history mentioned by the realtor. "No one's lived here for a while, but it's a decent place," the realtor said with a strained smile. The first few days were peaceful. Monica enjoyed the solitude, unpacked her belongings, and dreamed of the future. But soon, the nights started to unsettle her. Strange things began happening in the apartment. At first, they were subtle. She found items out of place and heard floorboards creak, as if someone were walking while she lay in bed. Everything changed one night when a strange sound woke her up. Monica awoke around midnight to a faint, almost inaudible whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind or a neighbor's TV. She pulled the blanket over herself and tried to fall back asleep, but the whisper persisted. It grew clearer. "Can you hear me?" The voice was barely perceptible, as though coming from far away. Monica froze. She listened closely, trying to determine the source of the sound. It was coming from her closet. Her closet. She lay paralyzed in bed, cold sweat running down her spine. She tried convincing herself it was just her imagination, but the whisper came again. "Can you hear me?" Gathering her courage, she jumped out of bed, turned on the light, and cautiously approached the closet. The doors were slightly ajar, almost as if inviting her to look inside. "Who's there?" she whispered, feeling the absurdity of her question. There was no reply. She slowly opened the closet door, ready to see anything, but all she found were her clothes hanging on their racks. The shelves seemed untouched. Convincing herself it was just a bad dream, she shut the closet and went back to bed. The next night, the voice returned. This time it sounded more insistent, as if the speaker was desperate for her to respond. "Why are you silent?" came the voice from the closet, making Monica scream. She jumped up again, turned on the light, and rushed to the closet. She shone a flashlight inside but found nothing once more. Fearing it might be a cruel prank or a sign her apartment wasn't safe, she called the police. The officers inspected the closet and the apartment but found nothing suspicious. "Maybe it's just your imagination," one of them said, noticing her trembling. Sometimes fatigue can cause hallucinations, but Monica knew it wasn't a dream. The voice was too real. On the third day, she decided to take photos of the closet, hoping to find some explanation for the strange event. She snapped several pictures with her phone and began reviewing them. In one of the photos, she noticed a strange reflection, as if something flickered in the corner of the closet. Zooming in, she saw something that made her heart stop. There was a silhouette resembling a human figure, but its face was blurred, as if smudged. Panicked, she tried calling the realtor, but there was no answer. Determined to get answers, Monica decided to find the apartment's owner. His contact information was listed in the lease agreement. The next day, Monica went to the address listed as the owner's residence. It was a house in the suburbs. When she knocked on the door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. "Hello?" she called out, stepping inside. There was no response. The house looked abandoned, but the interior was in disarray, as if someone had left in a hurry. She walked cautiously down the hallway until she reached the living room. There, she froze. The apartment's owner was lying on the floor. His body was contorted, and his face was twisted in terror, as if he had seen something unimaginably horrifying in his final moments. On the wall near his body, written in blood, were the words, "He's here. He's always here." Monica ran out of the house and immediately called the police. Soon after, she learned that the owner's death was deemed unusual, as there were no signs of physical trauma, and the blood used for the writing didn't belong to him. When Monica returned to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling she wasn't alone. She tried to ignore the closet, but now the voice was louder. It whispered her name, muttered incoherent phrases. "Open it," the voice repeated until she could no longer resist. That night, she opened the closet. At first, nothing happened, but as she leaned in to check the lower shelves, a raspy laugh echoed behind her. Turning around, she saw the closet was no longer empty. There was a face, twisted, eyeless, staring right at her. The next day, neighbors called the police after hearing loud screams from her apartment. When officers arrived, the door was locked from the inside. Upon entering, they found no trace of Monica, but a message was scrawled on the bedroom mirror. "She's with us now." To this day, no one dares to open that closet.